In Sacramento, California, is located one of the top railfan museums of the world, concentrating on the railroad history of California and the West. It houses in its 225,000 square foot space a full array of historical railroad items, including 19 steam locos, 8 of which were built before 1880. On entering the museum, you are greeted by Central Pacific Railroad's number 1, Governor Stanford, heading towards a full-size replica of a snow shed under construction. Central Pacific's number 1, Governor Stanford, is an American-type 440 steam locomotive. It's the first locomotive ordered by the newly incorporated Central Pacific Railroad in 1862 and built by Richard Norris and Sons of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. It was then shipped disassembled in crates around Cape Horn from Boston to San Francisco on board the sailing vessel Herald of the Morning. Transshipped to the river schooner Artful Dodger, it arrived in Sacramento on October 6, 1863, was unloaded the next day and reassembled. It was successfully fired up on November 6, 1863, and was named in honor of the railroad's then president, Leland Stanford, who was also Governor of California. She hauled the first revenue freight on the 25th September 1864, the first scheduled passenger train on the 15th of April 1864. In 1873 it was downgraded from mainline service, and until its retirement in 1895 it served as a switcher and fire engine, outfitted with a water pump and hose to extinguish small fires along the track. The Southern Pacific saved the historic engine from being scrapped, and she was refurbished and in 1899 presented to Jane Lathrop Stanford, the widow of the former California governor, Leland Stanford. She, in turn, donated the engine to Leland Stanford Junior University, where it was placed on display until May 1963, when the locomotive was loaned to the Pacific Coast chapter of the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society for inclusion in its historical railway equipment collection. These pieces, including the Governor Stanford, form the nucleus of the Californian State Railroad Museum collection, and today she occupies a prominent place in the museum, just a short distance from where she began her life 147 years ago. By 1865, the Central Pacific Railroad was concentrating its workforce on building a series of tunnels to cross the summit of the Sierra Nevada mountains, but the extreme weather at the highest elevations impeded progress. Snow-heavy areas were worked in the summer months, and, as winter approached, the construction leapfrogged east to lower elevations with milder temperatures. This pattern provided a short-term solution, but workers were digging out snow-impacted tracks as late as July, which left only a few months for construction and made winter rail travel on the completed tracks impossible. They thought they could handle it with the use of a gigantic snowplow with enough size and power to conquer the deepest blizzard. Scouts rode ahead to warn teamsters of their advance, because the noise so terrified horses and oxen that they would run wild. However, the winter of 1866-67 was the worst on record, and even the giant snowplow was no match for it. When the timber trestle at Cisco was destroyed during an avalanche, management at Central Pacific understood that something must be done, not just to continue building the railroad, but in order for trains to travel during the long winters on the operational tracks. Charles Croker came up with the idea of snow sheds over the next 2 years, 55 kilometres of which were built. After moving through a display telling the story of the construction of the Intercontinental Railway, we come across another veteran, Virginia and Truckee Railroad's number 12, Genoa, built in 1873. She is a classic example of the 440 American-type steam locomotive, the standard engine of most railroads in the United States for nearly 3 decades. The V&T Railway Company was a 21-mile standard gauge line between Carson City and Virginia City, and completed on January 29, 1870. Later, a 31-mile extension south from Reno to Carson City connected to Comstock with the Central Pacific Railroad in August of 1872. In late 1874, V&T's General Superintendent ordered two combination cars from the Detroit Car Works. Delivered in December of that year, cars 15 and 16 featured elegant interior ash, oak, and black walnut woodwork. Number 16 was used primarily on winter mixed passenger and freight trains. On the other side of the main floor from V&T number 12 is a typical narrow-gauge passenger train from the 1880s, headed by North Pacific Coast Railroad's number 12, Sonoma. She was one of three locomotives built in 1876 by the Boardman Locomotive Works of Philadelphia for the narrow-gauge North Pacific Coast Railroad. That railroad always faced financial difficulties, and at the end of 1879, the Sonoma was sold to the Nevada Central Railroad. The car at the end of the train is number 3. She was completed in December of 1881 in the shops of the Nevada Central Railway at Battle Mountain, and christened the Silver State for the Nevada State motto. It was the only passenger car built by the Nevada Central Railroad. Among the features on the bright yellow car are a saloon, a toilet, and a marble washstand. The star of the show, well, for me anyway, Southern Pacific's cab forward, number 4294. The cab forward design was useful in the long tunnels and snow sheds of Donner Pass and other mountainous regions, where it kept smoke, heat, and soot away from the operating crew, allowing them to breathe clean air in such enclosed spaces. Built by the Boardman Locomotive Works, one of a total class of 20, she entered service on March 19, 1944, hauling both freight and passenger trains, and was retired from active service on March 5, 1956. In September 1958, the now dieselised SP wrote off its 29 remaining cab forwards. The Pacific Coast chapter of the Railway and Locomotive Historical Society organised a campaign to save number 4294 from the scrap heap. And today, sadly, 4294 is the only cab forward left. She is 123 feet 8 inches long, or 37.69 metres, and quite a hefty lass, weighing at 475,000 kgs. Surrounded by mirrors, where visitors can appreciate all aspects of 1870s locomotive construction, is the Virginia and Truckee Railroad's number 13, Empire. The General Superintendent of that railroad, Henry M. Yerington, ordered steam locomotive number 13 early in October 1872, soon after the Nevada Short Line had completed its connection with the transcontinental Central Pacific at Reno. Number 13 Empire was delivered to the V&T in February of 1873. Empire was an appropriate namesake, Empire City, located 3 miles east of Carson City, and was an important territorial town and station on the overland route. In 1910, the Carson City shops converted the Empire from wood to fuel oil. Because V&T engine crews considered number 13 an unlucky number, the number was changed to number 15 at this time. There are 2 locomotives in this museum that have always excited my imagination of history. The first, of course, is Governor Stanford, and here is a second. Southern Pacific Railroad's number 1, C.P. Huntington. This diminutive steam locomotive was built for the Central Pacific Railroad by Danford, Cook and Company of Paterson, New Jersey in 1863. Shipped from New York around Cape Horn, it arrived in San Francisco March 19, 1864, on board the Mary Robinson. The railroad wanted to purchase a larger engine, but because of the Civil War, the C.P. Huntington and its sister engine, the T.D. Judea, were the only ones available. The C.P. Huntington, number 3 of the Central Pacific, was used in the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. In February 1871, it was transferred to the newly reorganized Southern Pacific Railroad and renumbered Number 1. Southern Pacific's number 2467 is one of 15 462 heavy Pacific type steam locomotives built by Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1921. They are designated the P8 class. 2467 was retired from service in 1956. It is still serviceable and on loan from its operator, Pacific Locomotive Association Incorporated. The only diesel I saw on display was this EMD F7 Western Pacific number 913. This locomotive was one that hauled the Californian Zephyr from Oakland, California to Salt Lake City, Utah from 1949 to 1970. This Fruit Growers Express refrigerator car, number 35832, was built in the company's Indiana Harbor shops in 1924. The steel-framed wood-sheathed car operated for 38 years in general railroad service until its retirement in 1962. Resting above all other trains on this elevated track is Nevada Short Line's number 1, a Baldwin-built 3-foot gauge 260, built in 1879. Upstairs we find this great Thomas the Tank play area for the kids and a fantastic toy train exhibit which features over 1,000 vintage toy trains, 6 interactive displays, and a magnificent operating toy train layout. Named after the esteemed collector and donor Thomas W. Sefton, who collected thousands of toy trains during his lifetime, and his family donated his prize collection to the museum in 2001. Back outside we have a quick look around Old Sacramento. Here is the original Central Pacific Railroad office and Huntington and Hopkins hardware store, the scene of Governor Stanford's first run.